Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the opening of the EMYA 2023 annual conference. Welcome to those of you here in Barcelona, and welcome to those few of you who are joining us in space and online. Let me begin by saying thank you, first of all, to MUBA, the Historical Museums of Barcelona, and behind MUBA, the Institute of Culture of Barcelona, who've seen to it that we meet in these beautiful surroundings, in this visual feast of these magnificent streets and buildings, and have ensured that we all have a chance to get acquainted with the multi-layered and multifaceted histories of this city in both its ancient and its contemporary forms. As a longtime friend of MUBA, I've enjoyed on a number of occasions their guided walks through the city, discovering lively locations, unexpected junctions, quirky infrastructures, and vibrant communities in the many different neighborhoods of which Barcelona is composed. Emerging from yet another metro station into yet another Barcelona, adding yet another edition of Barcelona to my personal psychogeographic map of this enchanting city. And as always, I want to thank our steadfast partners, the Council of Europe, Mayverd, now Mayverd Herons Group, Event, now Event Chercheurs Museum Studio, the Siletto Trust, Heritage and Museums, and not least the municipality of Portimao for their support, without which, frankly, we would hardly be here. And I wish to also thank our more invisible partners, the countries, ministries of cultures, museum associations, museum organizations that host us and underwrite some of our costs as the judges travel in their respective countries. I want to acknowledge the European Museum Forum trustees and the national correspondents who anchor us across the width of Europe, and not least the EMYA jury, chaired this year by Mina Kravac, Executive Director of the War Childhood Museum, a previous Council of Europe Museum Prize winner. I want to thank particularly two members of the jury who are leaving us now, Bernadette Lynch, who for reasons of health has had to cut back on some of her work commitments and unfortunately therefore cannot be with us today, and Mark O'Neill, who's right here, who has now reached the end of his 6-year tenure on the jury, two of this as the jury chair. And I want to thank Joetta van der Ploeg, who's I think over here, who is now retiring after more than a decade with this organization. First 6 years as an EMYA judge, and then EMF as a trustee. But most of all, I want to thank you, the EMYA candidates, without whom we definitely would not be here for the 46th cycle of this tiny but miraculously resilient organization of EMYA. Shaped historically through our close partnership with the Council of Europe, the European Museum Forum and the European Museum of the Year Award work within an overall framework of a commitment to citizenship, democracy, and human rights, to sustainability, and to bridging cultures and social and political borders. The different awards within the EMYA scheme reflect, represent, and emphasize different aspects and dimensions of these values. This rootedness in the explicit social and humanitarian value base sets the EMYA Award apart from other museum and heritage award schemes. Awarded continuously since 1977, the EMYA Awards, while remaining true to the original purpose of showcasing innovation and excellence in European museums, respond to long-term societal changes as well as to current social issues, and reflect the challenges, obligations, and opportunities which museums face at any given point of time. And I think you'll all agree with me that these challenges, obligations, and new opportunities have been not just numerous, but have been pretty intense these last couple of years. One of the candidate museums for EMYA 2023, wrote in the application for EMYA, "We have shown what even a small museum can be when the world we are living in demands action, and we've provided a platform for our community to show what they can achieve, sometimes against apparently overwhelming odds. This museum is not alone in expressing a growing commitment to address current social issues from the basis of their collection, of their locations, buildings, and core narratives, and in collaboration and dialogue with their communities and stakeholders. Some candidate museums have dug deeply into their institutional history and into the provenance of their collections to find vital keystones for new or renewed social relevance. The anarchist artist who a century ago foreshadowed a model of a sustainable future of self-reliance and social commitment, small-scale and local production. A sumptuous workers' assembly hall created as a focal point for enabling people to take part in democratic processes. The site of a political assassination living on as a powerful presence in the collective conscience of its society. The familiar and evocative narrative of chimney sweep children forming the platform for museum's current focus on 2030 sustainability goals around child labor, eradication of poverty, education for all. And rather than being spaces for nostalgia, as one museum puts it, museums develop discourses that address the present and the future, to connect with contemporary issues currently affecting our societies, and to give people the necessary tools to understand the present as another one continues. There seems this year to be an urgency heightened by the pandemic and by the wars. Currently, museums may not just change lives, but in some cases even save lives, as asserted by a museum that early on took on the responsibility of functioning as a COVID vaccination center. In the same vein, EMF and our host MUBA, the Barcelona History Museums, have chosen to place the concepts and contradictions of democracy and democratization as core themes for the EMYA 23 annual conference. We are all, it seems these days, wrestling with the angel of democracy, as Susan Griffin phrased it. For some of us, the question of democracy is an increasingly acute and clear either-or, while for others of us, its contours are becoming increasingly complex, opaque, obfuscated. Across the world, even long-term and established democracies are challenged by political polarization, by the multiple crises of rampant capitalism, by an unwillingness to acknowledge increasing societal inequalities, and not least frightening, by a paralyzed inability to deal with the destruction of nature to a point beyond regeneration. But across the world and in established democracies, there are also the protests and the demands for democracy now or more democracy, where representative democracy has fallen short of its own potential and needs reinterpretation and renewal. While egalitarian in intent, democracy as a political philosophy and political practice has been defined as much by whom and what it excludes as by whom and what it includes at a given point of time. Equal participation in democratic processes is not a given, but a hard-won fight and right, and it seems a continuous one. Rooted and mired in inequality, democracy promises equality. Born and steeped in exclusion, it promises inclusion. It's a concept of striving, of hope and aspiration for people to take equal part in the shaping and governing of their lives and their surroundings. It's a principle, a set of values and methods for respecting and negotiating disagreements, needs and rights, opportunities, responsibilities, and accountabilities. But, as if by definition, democracy is never complete, never finished, never fulfilled. Among the EMYA candidates, the awareness of the contradictions and conflicts, of the inequalities and lack of social justice in European societies seems to be growing increasingly stronger. Museums find themselves, sometimes inadvertently, as one of you says, embedded in big issues and big ideas, compelled to get involved in major issues relating to social inequality, to race, class, and the legacies of colonialism, and how these shape our understanding and experience today. Across the regions of Europe, museums explore the pendulum between pain and hope, as one museum expresses it, addressing the extreme of exclusion and political repression, the loss of one's homeland in violence and wars, the forced migration and displacement, the exhumation of long-hidden mass graves from a not-so-distant dictatorship. Museums memorialize these unique and specific events, they say, translating and transforming them into appeals for collective reflection and universal calls for truth, peace, justice, and democracy. Other museums find their calling, their voice, and their platform at times and places where democracy attempts to democratize itself, where it expands and supplements itself with new methods and seeps, so to speak, into new areas, new realms. Open public dialogues, public hearings, local organizations pull and stretch the concept of democracy into local neighborhoods, apartment blocks, schools, workplaces, to address and absorb people's diverse, specific, and often contradictory needs and wants. And, or I could say, but for all museums, regardless of their history, their collections, and their specific subject matter, there lingers the challenge of democratizing the museum institution itself. For more than half a century, governments and legislation have called for equal access to culture for all, and yet this basic democratic aspiration remains massively unmet in the museum sector. Several of this year's EMYA candidates voiced their ambition to be relevant and useful for all, to combat the invisible doors, as one museum says, that sort people by class and education, and to aim for an atmosphere of belonging, ownership, and empowerment for all visitors. Some museums also acknowledge that this empowerment of their visitors and solidarity with their communities will only be achieved through long-term, continuous commitment to cultural inclusion and participation, and will only happen in step with equally long-term and deep internal transformation of the museum into non-hegemonic forms of organization. Kenneth Hudson, EMYA's founder, had a typical terse axiom that pinpointed the costs we have from the lack of internal institutional democracy. I have never, said Kenneth, I've never seen a good museum run by a dictator. The museum sector has many crossroads to navigate right now. Each year, EMYA candidate museums present new paradigms and new models for what a museum is or could be. As they seek more sustainable practices, museums tend to strengthen their local anchoring, become broader in their scope and themes, and expand their engagement into several fields. They multiply and diversify their functions and develop richer and closer partnerships. For some of this year's candidates, museum practice, sustainability goals, and concrete visions for alternative types of social organization and everyday life come together almost seamlessly. One museum committed to human rights, to sufficient and adequate food, and to the UN goals of sustainable consumption and production offers visitors not only its own wildlife garden and bees, but an entry into a whole area of an organic farm, an artisan restaurant and grocery store, a bakery, a cheese dairy, a butcher's shop, and a local distribution company, all allowing visitors access and insight into their working processes. Another organization, an art museum with a nature reserve, found that already a century ago, the artists around whom the museum was founded had shown a path of combining high art with an ecological focus and the ambitions of a revolutionary, pacifist, back-to-nature and anti-capitalist society. This museum's art connection now live within an entity of an ecological allotment garden, cows in the orchard, a dog walking area, ecological playgrounds, a food forest, heritage workshops, and the use of the attic space of the farmstead as a meeting place for local associations. Each year in EMYA, we see these boundaries around museums becoming thinner and more porous, and the definition of museum becoming more and more fluid. So let me finish. This past year has been one of polarization also within the European museum sector itself. Hesitant and unsure how to define the role and responsibility of museums on major social issues, the museum sector has found itself on the wrong side of conflicts, targeted and exposed as part of the problem of climate change and the destruction of nature. Museums have found ourselves deeply divided and publicly conflicted on ethical and professional issues of race and racism, colonialism, repatriation and restitution. Individuals have found themselves targeted and ostracized by colleagues. In the 2010s, a slogan emerged from the Copenhagen Underground, which I really appreciated at the time. "Disagreement makes us stronger," it said. "Disagreement makes us stronger." I'm probably a little less hopeful now, with a bit less faith in radical democracy than I was then, but I do hope that this EMYA 2023 will function as an occasion, as a time and place for much needed safe, open, respectful, and unprejudiced reflection and self-reflection among us all. Thank you and welcome to all.